So last time I wrote about the internal work of repositioning, about imposter syndrome, about the discipline of holding your new professional identity when everything in you wants to retreat to the safer, more familiar version of yourself. So I did not plan for this week to be a continuation of that conversation, but it is, because I then went and rebuilt my own house. I separated my professional presence into two distinct websites. And it wasn't because someone told me to, but because I had arrived finally and undeniably at the point where keeping everything under one roof was creating exactly the kind of confusion I've spent my professional time helping other people to resolve. I was living, in my own positioning, the problem that I write about every week in this publication. The right audience was landing in the wrong place. The wrong audience was landing in the right place. And nobody, including me, was being served well by it. Welcome to Recognised. I'm Merisha Stevenson, BBC broadcaster, executive facilitator and commercial authority strategist. This is where I explore the gap between visibility and authority and what it actually takes to be recognised as the expert you already are. Today, I'm doing something slightly different. I'm taking you inside a decision I made this week, advice I would have given to a client actually, and I've taken it myself. Because I think the most useful thing I can do as someone who writes about repositioning is to show you what it actually looks like when I have to do it myself. And I do. I'm on this journey as well. For a period of time, MerishaSpeaks.com was doing two jobs simultaneously, and I knew it. I've known it for longer than I'm entirely comfortable to admit, but hey, here we are. On one hand, it was the home of my identity as a broadcaster, executive facilitator, strategic moderator, and communicator. My work in rooms, on stages, and on air. The facilitation commissions, the hosting work, the moderating of high-stakes conversations between senior people. 20 years behind a microphone and 23 years around a boardroom table, converging into something I know is genuinely distinctive. On the other hand, it was also the home of my commercial authority repositioning work. The strategic practice of helping founders, consultants, senior leaders and organisations close the gap between their expertise and the commercial recognition it deserves. Those two things share a foundation, but they're not the same offer. They don't speak to the same audience and they don't answer the same question. And asking one website to communicate both clearly to two different kinds of people who arrive with two very different needs really has been asking the impossible. The person looking for an executive facilitator was landing alongside positioning strategy content that was not for them. And of course, the founder looking for commercial authority support was navigating around facilitation and broadcast work that was not relevant to their search. Both were leaving with less clarity than they arrived with. And of course, that's not a website problem. It's a positioning problem that my website was making visible. And I'd been allowing it to persist because fixing it meant making a decision that felt from the inside like dividing something that I had just made whole. You know? But I had to get real. I had to take feedback. And this is the part I think a lot of people skip over when they talk about rebranding and repositioning. And that's the practical work of actually separating the two websites. Wasn't really that complicated. It was the internal work of accepting that the two distinct identities needed two separate homes. That I found harder. As is recognising the evolution and just not being wedded to a former iteration. Because what I was doing in separating MerishaSpeaks.com from Media Impact Lab and then rebranding it to thecommercialauthority.com was making a public declaration about how I understand my own professional identity. Not as a single consolidated thing that can be explained in one place with one message, but actually as two distinct and genuinely different bodies of work, each of which deserves to be seen clearly on its own terms without the other creating noise around it. Because I've never been great at doing one thing at a time. So Merisha Speaks is now the home of my identity as a broadcaster, executive facilitator, and strategic communicator. The facilitation, the hosting, the moderation, the broadcast work, the high pressure communication environments where everything I've built over 20 years in broadcasting and 23 years in boardrooms converges into something I know that is genuinely distinctive. And then we have the commercial authority, which is now the home of my authority positioning work. The strategic, commercially rooted practice of helping experts, founders, senior leaders, and organizations build the kind of positioning that generates the right opportunities at the right level. 2 websites, 2 audiences, 2 clear and distinct answers to 2 very different questions. And the moment I made that separation, something settled. Not so much externally and not in the market, because that's going to take a little bit of time, and I know that. But internally, the clarity that I've been writing about in this publication, that I talk about with my clients, the kind that has to exist inside before it can be communicated outside, arrived in a more complete form than it had been before. Now, I want to explain why the Media Impact Lab has become the commercial authority. Because I do feel I owe my audience an honest account, again, of my own thinking. The Media Impact Lab was named for the observation that started this work in the first place. Years of watching people be given significant platforms, broadcast opportunities, speaking invitations, media moments, and just not being able to fully utilize them. And it wasn't because they lacked expertise, but because they were not speaking from a coherent position of authority. Because when people got it right, they got it right. They just weren't capitalizing on those moments in ways that allowed them to compound. That observation is a real one, and it still exists. And my media background remains central to what I do and the value that I feel I bring my clients. But the name Media Impact Lab has become associated in the minds of many, encountering it really primarily with media training, with getting on podcasts, with improving broadcast performance, with the surface of visibility rather than the commercial substance that sits underneath it. And of course, that's not the whole story, because here is what I know as someone who has spent 25 years in business, a decade in global risk management and audit, and 23 years as a board member and director. All of the positioning in the world doesn't matter if it's not there to improve your commercial situation. Seriously, what's the point? Positioning is not an end in itself. It has to be a commercial instrument. And my clients are founders, consultants, experts, senior leaders who want their expertise to generate more of the right commercial opportunities. They want their positioning to do a commercial job. And what the commercial authority offers, what makes it genuinely distinctive, is that I bring my full professional background to that commercial objective. The media expertise, absolutely yes, but also the business acumen, the risk and audit thinking, the board level strategic perspective, the understanding of what authority actually has to do commercially to justify the investment in building it. And I don't think that combination is common. And the name needed to reflect the commercial seriousness of the work rather than the media observation that originally prompted it. I've heard the argument for keeping everything under one roof, that it demonstrates range, that it shows breadth, that separating things makes you look smaller rather than more focused. And frankly, I disagree. Consolidation feels like strength, but in a market where attention is scarce, and the window for making the right impression is very narrow, consolidation that creates confusion is not strength at all. It just becomes noise with good intention, and we all know what that looks like. Now when I look at my 2 websites, what I see is not division, but I see concentration. Each offer speaking with complete clarity to the audience it's actually for. without the other creating static around it. Neither audience has to navigate around something that is just not for them. And neither offer has to compete for attention with something that, however related in its foundations, is speaking to a fundamentally different need. That is what clarity earns, not a smaller presence, a more precise one. And precision in a market where most people are trying to be everything to everyone is one of the most commercially powerful choices that you can actually make. I've spent the last few months writing about the gap between expertise and recognition, about borrowed authority and identity gaps, and the internal work that has to happen before external repositioning can hold. This last week, I lived it in a much more concrete and immediate way than usual. And what I was reminded of is that this work is never finished. Repositioning is not a project with a completion date. It's an ongoing, deliberate practice of ensuring that how I am understood in the market keeps pace with how I'm actually evolving. And if you have been reading Recognized and recognizing yourself in the patterns that I've been describing, then perhaps the question worth sitting with today is, what in my own professional presence has been doing two jobs simultaneously when it should be doing one? What clarity have I been deferring because the decision to separate things felt from the inside like dividing something that should stay whole or together? Because the market will not give you credit for complexity if it can't see it, but it will give you credit for clarity it can actually act on. Both worlds are now open. If you're looking for an executive facilitator, a strategic moderator, or broadcast communicator, merishaspeaks.com is where the conversation starts. But if you're a founder, consultant, or senior leader who is ready to close the gap between your expertise and the commercial recognition it deserves, well then, thecommercialauthority.com is where that work happens. This is Recognized. I'm Merisha Stevenson. The full written version of this essay is on my Substack at merishaspeaks.substack.com. I've built 2 houses this week because one house was no longer telling the truth about actually what was inside of it. Your feedback is welcome. Until next time, stay visible, stay credible, and most importantly, stay recognized.